A paycheck can get bigger on paper and still feel smaller in real life. That's the trap. Because in Canada right now, wages are rising. The numbers say workers are earning more. Inflation is lower than it was. Interest rates are no longer at the peak. So why do so many Canadians still feel broke? Why does a raise disappear so fast? Why does payday still feel like recovery instead of progress? And why does earning more still not feel like moving forward? Because higher wages are not the same thing as relief. And that is the part a lot of headlines miss. In this video, we're going to break down why Canadians can be earning more and still feel financially stuck, why lower inflation doesn't automatically fix the damage of the last few years, and why the biggest pressure points in everyday life are still swallowing income faster than people expected. Let's start with the contradiction. In February 2026, the average hourly wage for employees in Canada was $37.56, up from a year earlier, while average hourly wages for permanent employees rose 2% year over year to $38.49. On paper, that sounds like progress, and in one sense, it is. A lot of Canadians are earning more than they were before, but here is the problem. Your life is not priced in averages. It is priced in bills. And the bills that matter most still feel heavy. Canada's headline inflation rate slowed to 1.8% in February 2026. That sounds like good news. But food purchased from stores was still up 4.1% year over year, and Statistics Canada says grocery prices are still 30.1% higher than they were in February 2021. Food purchased from restaurants rose 7.8%. So even when inflation looks calmer, the parts of life people feel every single week still do not feel cheap. That is the first reason higher wages still don't feel like relief. Because slowing inflation is not the same thing as rolling prices back. If your pay went up 4%, but the things that define your life are still sitting at a much higher level than they used to be, you do not experience that as freedom. You experience it as catching up. And catching up is not the same thing as getting ahead. That is why a raise can feel emotionally weak, even when it looks decent on paper. The number is bigger. But the baseline cost of being a normal person is also bigger. Groceries are heavier, rent is heavier, going out is heavier, insurance is heavier. And once those costs settle at a higher level, your income has to do more than just rise. It has to rebuild the breathing room that already disappeared. That is where a lot of Canadians are stuck. Not in poverty on paper, but in permanent compression. Earning enough to keep moving, but not enough to feel secure. And that pressure gets worse when the labor market itself starts feeling less stable. Statistics Canada's Labour Force Survey says employment fell by 84,000 inches. February 2026, the employment rate dropped to 60.6%, and the unemployment rate rose to 6.7%. For young people aged 15 to 24, unemployment was even higher. That means workers are trying to feel better in an economy where job confidence itself is starting to weaken. That matters more than people think. Because a higher wage feels very different when you trust the next 6 months. If you think your job is stable, a raise feels like progress. If the job market feels shakier, that same raise feels like protection. And protection is not the same as prosperity. That is another reason people still feel broke. The money is not being felt as extra. It is being felt as insurance against what could go wrong next. And then there is housing. Even when the exact topic of the video is wages, housing is still sitting in the middle of the story because shelter is the bill that shapes everything else. Statistics Canada says shelter inflation was still 1.5% year over year in February, and rent itself was still up 3.9%. So even though housing pressure is cooler than before, it is still large enough to absorb a big part of any income gain. That is why so many people feel like every improvement in earnings disappears before it changes their life. The money does not get a chance to become optional. It gets captured by the essentials. And once essentials absorb the raise, the rest of life still feels financially tight. Saving money feels hard. Job changes feel risky. Eating out feels easier to cut than to enjoy. Big purchases get delayed. And the emotional result is simple. You earn more, but you don't feel richer. That doesn't mean the wage growth is fake. It means the pressure is real. There is also a psychological reason this feels worse than the raw numbers suggest. People do not measure progress by comparing this month to last year's spreadsheet. They measure progress by asking a simpler question. Does life feel easier? And for a lot of Canadians, the answer is still no. Because life is not experienced through headline CPI. It is experienced through the grocery store, the rent payment, the restaurant bill you skip, the amount left in your account after the basics are covered. That is why the official story and the live story can feel so different. The official story is, inflation is lower, wages are rising, rates are no longer at the peak. The live story is, I still cannot breathe. And those two things can be true at the same time. The Bank of Canada held its policy rate at 2.25% on the 18th of March, 2026. But also warned that the war in the Middle East has increased volatility in global energy prices and financial markets. In other words, even with lower rates than before, the broader environment is still uncertain enough that households are not feeling safe. And safety is what people are actually missing, not just a bigger paycheck. Safety. The feeling that one repair, one renewal, one bad month, one job shock, or one grocery run is not going to knock the whole budget sideways. That is why higher wages still don't feel like relief in Canada. Because the damage from the last few years was not just about inflation, it was about the new level of cost of living. Once the basics reset higher, income gains have to work twice. First, to keep up, then, to rebuild space. And most people are still stuck in the first stage. So what changes next? Probably not a dramatic reset. More likely, a slow and uneven improvement. If wages keep rising faster than headline inflation, that helps. But as long as groceries, housing, and everyday essentials remain elevated, many Canadians will keep feeling like their paycheck is running on a treadmill. That is the real answer to the question. Why do Canadians still feel broke even when wages are up? Because more pay is not the same thing as more freedom. Because inflation slowing down is not the same thing as life getting cheap again. Because essentials still control the budget. Because job insecurity changes how people feel income. And because a raise does not feel powerful when it arrives after years of financial damage. So yes, the wage number is better. But for millions of Canadians, the feeling of stability still isn't. And that's the difference that matters. If your paycheck feels bigger but your life doesn't, you're not imagining it. You're living through a period where the numbers improve faster than real life did. And until the cost of ordinary life eases in the places that hurt most, higher wages will keep feeling less like progress and more like survival. If you want more explainers on why life in Canada still feels expensive, from the weak dollar to groceries to the middle-class squeeze, subscribe to Boreal Briefing and watch the next video in this series.